What happens when a retired black veteran takes on a billion-dollar corporation in court after they stole his land? Facing an overwhelming challenge, he is mocked and dismissed by the judge and the powerful elites. With nothing but evidence, determination, and his genius-level legal skills, can he reclaim justice for himself? Like, subscribe, and let's dive into the story. The courtroom of Richmond County was packed, the air thick with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. This wasn't just another property dispute. This was Malcolm Mack Bishop, a man who had spent his life standing his ground, now doing it in a place where few thought he belonged a courtroom. He stood at the plaintiff's table, tall and unwavering, his dark skin lined with the years of battles fought outside of legal walls. His presence alone commanded attention, but the expressions around him told the same story. They didn't take him seriously. Spectators whispered among themselves, some smirking, others elbowing their neighbors, as if this was some sort of spectacle. Reporters scribbled notes, their pens racing across paper as they prepared headlines that practically wrote themselves. Local man takes on corporate giant and Losies. The murmur of hushed conversations filled the room, mixing with the occasional flash of a cell phone camera, capturing the moment as though it were entertainment rather than justice unfolding. At the defense table, Ethan Calloway, the CEO of Fairmont Development, sat with a calm, calculated air. He was a man who had built an empire on deals, on knowing the right people, on understanding that, in the end, power spoke louder than principle. And sitting beside him, in an impeccable gray suit, was Jonathan Reed, his lead attorney, a man as polished as he was ruthless, his reputation built on crushing cases like these before they could ever pose a real threat. Reed wasn't worried. He had seen men like Mack Bishop before, men who thought righteousness was enough to win a case. It wasn't. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and the bailiff's voice rang out, cutting through the low hum of voices. All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Coleman. Judge Coleman entered, a man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, his robe flowing behind him as he made his way to the bench. He had been on the bench long enough to know when a case was worth his time, and when it was just another futile attempt by a man punching above his weight. This one, he had already decided, was the latter. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at Mack, and smirked. "Mr. Bishop," Coleman said, his voice carrying through the room as he tapped his gavel once, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter." Mack nodded once, his gaze steady. "That's right, Your Honor." A low chuckle rippled through the room. A few people shook their heads, amused. Even Calloway, normally composed, allowed himself a small smirk. This was going to be easy. Judge Coleman leaned back slightly. "Mr. Bishop, you do understand that legal proceedings aren't the same as, well, whatever fights you might be used to. This isn't a bar brawl or a Sunday sermon. The law is complicated, filled with procedures, nuances. It's not as simple as just making a speech and expecting the world to change." Another round of muffled laughter. Mack didn't flinch. He let them have their moment. He had spent a lifetime watching men like these men who thought that power made them invincible, that their wealth or status would protect them from consequences. He knew better. "I understand the law just fine, Your Honor," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "And I understand my rights." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Judge Coleman exhaled through his nose, glancing at Reed, who was already rising from his seat. The defense attorney adjusted his cuffs and stepped forward, his movements smooth, practiced. "Your Honor," Reed began, his tone filled with well-rehearsed politeness, "I'd like to formally request that Mr. Bishop be required to retain proper legal counsel. While I respect his enthusiasm, legal matters are complex. A self-represented plaintiff attempting to argue property law. It's not just unusual, it's a waste of this court's time." Judge Coleman turned to Mack. "Do you have a response, Mr. Bishop?" Mack let the silence settle before he spoke. "I do." He took a slow step forward, resting his hands lightly on the plaintiff's table. "This is a public court, Your Honor. Justice doesn't belong to the people who can afford the best lawyers. It belongs to the truth." He turned, looking directly at Reed. "And the truth is simple, my land was stolen." The chuckles stopped. Mack reached into his file, pulling out a neatly bound stack of documents, tapping the top page lightly with his fingers. "I've spent the last year going through every land survey, Every zoning law, every property statute that applies to this case. I've got records. I've got photographic evidence. I've got legal precedent. I've got everything I need to prove that Fairmont Development built on my land without my consent." His voice never rose. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need theatrics. He just had the facts. Judge Coleman shifted slightly. Calloway's smirk faded. Even Reed, the seasoned litigator, hesitated before responding. "That may be so, Mr. Bishop," Reed said, regaining his composure, "but reading a few law books doesn't make you a lawyer. The law is about interpretation, precedent, expertise." He gestured vaguely, as if dismissing Mack's research as irrelevant. "You might think you understand the law, but do you really?" Mack didn't blink. He just leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Reed. "I understand the law well enough to know when someone's breaking it." The words hung in the air. Judge Coleman sighed, rubbing his temples. This wasn't what he had expected. He had thought this case would be a novelty and amusing spectacle at best, a clear-cut ruling at worst. But Bishop wasn't playing the part they had assigned him. He wasn't bumbling through legal jargon or tripping over his own arguments. He was methodical. And that made things complicated. Coleman exhaled. "Very well, Mr. Bishop," he said finally. "You may proceed." Mack gave a small nod and took his seat. Across the room, Reed sat down slowly, adjusting his tie, his easy confidence now slightly rattled. Calloway, sensing the shift in tone, leaned toward his lawyer and whispered, "He's bluffing." Reed didn't answer. Because for the first time he wasn't entirely sure. And as the trial officially began, there was one undeniable truth hanging in the air: this was no ordinary case. And Malcolm Bishop was no ordinary man. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as Malcolm Mack Bishop remained seated, calm and composed, while Jonathan Reed shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Richard Coleman tapped his gavel lightly, clearing his throat as he addressed the room. "Mr. Bishop, you may proceed with your opening statement." Mack stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his posture unwavering. He wasn't a man who needed to rush. He had learned long ago that silence had a weight of its own. He let the quiet stretch, forcing the room to sit in its own anticipation. Then, when the moment was right, he spoke. "In 1989, I purchased a stretch of land in Augusta, Georgia. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I built my home on it. I worked that land with my own hands. I paid my taxes. I made sure it was in line with every regulation this county put in place." His voice was steady, unwavering. "But last year, Fairmont Development decided that my land wasn't mine anymore." He reached into his stack of documents, pulled out a set of aerial photographs, and placed them on the plaintiff's table. He slid the first image forward. "This," he said, tapping the first photo, "is my land in 2022. My property line is marked, recorded, and legally documented." He reached for another, his fingers tapping against the glossy surface of the image. "And this," he said, sliding it forward, "is my land in 2023. You see that?" The room leaned forward. The difference was clear. What had once been untouched land was now disrupted by construction, steel beams rising where open ground had been. A fence had been extended, slicing into his property. "That," Mack said, "is Fairmont's development project. And that, Your Honor, is my land they built on without my consent." Reed exhaled through his nose, rising to his feet as if already preparing to counter, but Mack wasn't finished. He reached for another document, an email, printed and stapled, neatly highlighted in places. He held it up. "This," he said, turning it slightly toward the jury, "is the cease and desist notice I sent to Fairmont's legal team when I first saw the construction creeping past my property line." He flipped to another page. "This is the second one. Another. The third." He paused. "I sent them every legal warning I could. They ignored them all." Mack turned his attention to Ethan Calloway, the CEO of Fairmont, who had remained mostly silent, arms crossed as he watched the proceedings. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway, how many of these emails did you personally respond to?" Reed shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Bishop is attempting to cross-examine a witness who has not been sworn in." Judge Coleman looked at Mack, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Bishop, let's keep this within procedural bounds. Mack nodded, slipping the emails back into his file. Understood. But he had already made his point. Reed took a measured breath and approached the center of the courtroom, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Coleman gave him a nod, and Reed turned to face the jury, his voice smooth, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're seeing here is an emotional appeal. Mr. Bishop has certainly done his homework, and I commend him for his dedication, but the law isn't about passion, it's about precision. The question we must ask is whether or not Mr. Bishop's claim is legally sound." He walked over to the defense table, picking up a thick, leather-bound folder. "What we have here," he continued, lifting it slightly, "is extensive documentation showing that Fairmont Development followed all necessary zoning procedures before beginning construction. These records confirm that the boundaries of Mr. Bishop's land were, at best, ambiguous." He turned to Mack, tilting his head slightly. "Now, I don't doubt that Mr. Bishop believes he's right, but belief doesn't equal fact. And the fact is property lines are complicated. Sometimes they shift. Sometimes what we think we own isn't actually what we own." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile designed to disarm, to make a jury feel like they were being gently led toward the inevitable. "And that's why we have experts, professionals, people who spend their entire careers studying land ownership laws, because it's not as simple as drawing a line in the dirt and calling it yours." Mack leaned back in his chair, watching, waiting. He had seen men like Reed before. Men who talked circles around the truth, dressing it up in enough technicalities to make people forget what was real and what was manipulation. Reed continued, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, while I respect Mr. Bishop's commitment to his case, I would like to move that we establish, as a legal matter, whether or not the boundary of his land was properly assessed before this claim was filed. Without a formal, state-verified survey to confirm his allegations, we are operating purely on assumption." Judge Coleman nodded slightly, then turned to Mack. "Mr. Bishop, do you have a verified survey of your property line?" Mack didn't hesitate. "I do, Your Honor." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, crossed Reed's face. Mack reached into his stack of files and pulled out a crisp document, flipping to the page marked with a white-yellow tab. "This is my property's official survey, conducted 5 years ago by the county's own land assessor. It clearly defines the exact boundary lines, and they haven't changed since." He handed the document to the bailiff, who walked it over to Judge Coleman. The judge adjusted his glasses, skimming the report. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Mack turned back to Reed, his voice steady. "You were saying?" Reed exhaled, forcing a chuckle. "Mr. Bishop, while I appreciate your enthusiasm, property disputes are rarely this black and white. The nuances of zoning law often mean that." Mack raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You ignored the law until you got caught." The words landed like a blow. The room was still. Even Judge Coleman seemed to absorb the weight of that statement before finally clearing his throat. "Mr. Bishop, let's keep this civil." Mack nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." Reed took a deep breath, straightening his tie, but the energy in the room had already shifted. The chuckles from earlier were gone. The quiet dismissals had faded. Now there was something else in the air, uncertainty. Across the room, Ethan Calloway narrowed his eyes at Reed, leaning in. "You said we had this under control," he muttered under his breath. Reed set his jaw. "We do, but for the first time since the trial began, he wasn't sure if that was true. And Malcolm Bishop, the man they had underestimated, wasn't done yet." The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The casual amusement that had lingered at the beginning of the trial had evaporated, replaced by something far more serious. Jonathan Reed, ever the polished attorney, adjusted his cuffs, his mind working overtime to regain control. He had assumed this case would be simple, a routine dismissal of a self-represented plaintiff with little legal knowledge. But Malcolm Bishop wasn't floundering. He wasn't tripping over procedures or grasping at straws. He was presenting facts. And facts, Reed knew, were dangerous when wielded by a man who understood their power. Judge Richard Coleman exhaled, flipping through the official property survey Mack had just submitted. His fingers traced the edges of the document, as if he were weighing the weight of what had just been placed before him. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Reed, given that Mr. Bishop has provided a state-verified survey confirming the original property lines, I assume the defense is its own survey to refute these claims." Reed hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Mack to notice. That was all he needed. "We do, Your Honor," Reed finally said, his voice smooth but lacking its earlier confidence. "The defense will be presenting expert testimony later today that clarifies the inconsistencies in the boundary definitions." Mack leaned forward slightly, his voice even. "Inconsistencies, Mr. Reed. That's an interesting choice of words, because according to the county's own records, there are none." Reed forced a tight-lipped smile. "Property law is rarely that simple, Mr. Bishop." Mack nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I agree. Simple isn't the word I'd use. Deliberate is more like it." The tension in the room thickened. Ethan Calloway, who had been sitting quietly at the defense table, turned slightly toward his lawyer, lowering his voice just enough for Reed to hear. "This isn't going how you said it would." Reed didn't respond, but the way his jaw tightened said enough. Judge Coleman tapped his gavel lightly, calling for order before turning back to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Bishop, if you have additional evidence to present, let's proceed." Mack stood, his movements unhurried, as he reached for another folder. He opened it, revealing a series of photographs. With precise motions, he walked to the bailiff and handed them over. "Your Honor, these are aerial photographs taken over the last 3 years. They clearly show the expansion of Fairmont Development's construction, encroaching further onto my land with each passing month." Judge Coleman studied the images, his brow furrowing slightly as he flipped through them. The pictures left little room for interpretation. What had once been untouched land was now paved over, occupied by steel and concrete. The incursion was undeniable. Mack turned to the jury. "You don't need a law degree to see what's in these photos. You don't need years of legal training to understand what's happening here. Fairmont didn't just misinterpret property lines. They ignored them." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jonathan Reed rose quickly, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Bishop is making inflammatory statements without allowing the defense to respond." Judge Coleman turned a measured gaze toward Reed. "Objection overruled. You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Reed. For now, Mr. Bishop is simply presenting his evidence." Reed clenched his jaw but sat back down, exhaling through his nose. Mack continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. He reached for another document. "Your Honor, this is a copy of the cease and desist order I filed with the county last year, demanding that Fairmont halt construction until the property dispute was resolved." He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Fairmont was served this order. They received it. And they ignored it. He turned to Reed. "Tell me, Mr. Reed, do you have documentation proving that Fairmont stopped construction in response to this order?" Reed didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. "The defense will demonstrate that our clients acted within the legal framework provided to them." Mack raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's not what I asked. I asked if you have proof that Fairmont stopped construction." He let the silence linger before answering for him. "Because they didn't." Another murmur spread through the room, this time more pronounced. Mack turned toward Ethan Calloway now, his voice steady. "You had every opportunity to fix this before it went to trial. You had every chance to do the right thing. But you didn't. And now, here we are." Calloway's fingers curled into fists against the table. Reed shot up from his seat again, his patience fraying. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is badgering my client." Judge Coleman exhaled, looking unimpressed. "Mr. Bishop, let's keep this focused on the evidence." Mack gave a small nod. "Understood, Your Honor." He turned back toward his table and picked up another document, tapping it lightly against the wood before setting it down. "One last thing." He glanced at the jury, making sure he had their full attention. "Fairmont Development has had property disputes before." Jonathan Reed visibly stiffened. Mack slid a file forward. "This is a record of past legal actions taken against Fairmont over the last 15 years. 5 separate cases, all involving unauthorized expansion beyond legally defined boundaries." Reed immediately stood again. "Objection. This is irrelevant. Prior disputes have no bearing on this case." Judge Coleman studied Mack for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Reed. "That depends, Mr. Reed. If a pattern of behavior is relevant, then I'd say it's worth reviewing." Reed opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself, jaw tightening. Mack pressed on. "Your Honor, I'm not just here for my land. I'm here because Fairmont has been doing this for years, and they've gotten away with it." He turned his attention back to the jury, letting his words settle. They thought I'd roll over like the others. They thought I'd take a settlement and walk away. They thought wrong. The courtroom was silent now, heavy with the weight of what had just been laid out. Judge Coleman cleared his throat. I think we've heard enough for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted into motion, reporters scrambling, people whispering, 100 conversations overlapping at once. Ethan Calloway stood, his expression tight with barely restrained fury as he leaned toward Reed. We have a problem. Reed's face was pale, his confidence shaken. Yeah, he muttered. We do. Across the room, Mac remained seated for a moment, watching them. Then, with the same calm he had carried since walking into that courtroom, he gathered his documents, adjusted his jacket, and walked out. Because this wasn't over yet. Not even close. The morning air outside the Richmond County Courthouse was crisp, but inside, the tension had settled into a thick, almost suffocating weight. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, waiting to beam the latest developments to the world. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices hushed but urgent, delivering breathless updates about the trial that had gripped the town. What had started as an almost laughable case, an aging black man taking on a corporate giant without a lawyer, had become something else entirely. Inside, Malcolm Mac Bishop walked through the double doors with the same unshaken resolve he had carried from day one. He didn't acknowledge the cameras flashing in his direction or the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered to see how today's proceedings would unfold. His mind was clear, his steps steady. He had spent his life standing his ground, and today would be no different. At the defense table, Ethan Calloway sat rigid, his jaw clenched as he whispered something harshly to Jonathan Reed. The CEO was no longer the relaxed, smirking man who had walked into this trial certain of its outcome. He was stiff now, his fingers tapping against the table in frustration. Reed, for his part, looked just as tense. Gone was the effortless confidence of a man in control. He knew everyone knew that the case had spiraled far beyond what they had anticipated. Judge Richard Coleman entered, his black robe flowing as he settled behind the bench. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking, his tone clipped. Let's get back to it. Jonathan Reed stood first, smoothing down his suit as he approached the jury. He had spent the night regrouping, recalibrating his approach. His job now was not just to defend Fairmont Development, but to regain the courtroom's momentum. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice measured. Yesterday we heard a compelling story. Mr. Bishop stood here and presented documents, emails, and surveys, all of which, on the surface, paint a picture of injustice. But let's take a step back. He walked slowly, gesturing lightly with one hand. The reality of property law is that it's never as black and white as one might think. There are complexities, oversights, and yes, mistakes. No one is denying that construction expanded past an originally defined property line. The question is whether it was intentional, whether it was a deliberate act of theft or a simple misunderstanding. Reed turned toward Mac, offering him a rehearsed, almost sympathetic look. Mr. Bishop has lived on this land for decades, and I respect that. But memory is not the same as law, and while Mr. Bishop believes that his property was unlawfully taken, our records show that the boundary lines have been subject to reassessment over time. What he sees as an encroachment, we see as an administrative discrepancy. He turned back to the jury. And discrepancies are not crimes. He let that hang in the air before stepping back toward his table. Now, to clarify this further, I'd like to call our first expert witness, Mr. James Whitaker, a senior land assessor with over 35 years of experience. There was movement in the courtroom as a balding man in his 60s made his way to the stand, his expression neutral as he raised his hand to be sworn in. Once seated, Reed approached, his tone light, conversational. Mr. Whitaker, can you explain to the court how property boundaries can shift over time? Whitaker nodded. Certainly. Land assessments are conducted periodically, and various factors, weather, erosion, construction, even updated surveying techniques, can lead to slight modifications in property lines. In some cases, property lines are misinterpreted due to outdated records, which is why resurveying is necessary. Reed smiled as if Whitaker had just confirmed everything he needed. So in your professional experience, would you say it's possible that Mr. Bishop's understanding of his property line may not match the most updated records? Whitaker hesitated slightly, adjusting his glasses. It's possible. That was all Reed needed. He nodded, giving a brief glance toward the jury. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. No further questions. As Reed returned to his seat, Mack stood, adjusting the sleeves of his jacket as he made his way toward the witness stand. His pace was slow, deliberate. Mr. Whitaker, Mack began, his voice steady, you've been in this business for 35 years, correct? Whitaker nodded. That's right. Mack tilted his head slightly. And in those 35 years, how often have you seen developers like Fairmont push past legal boundaries, hoping no one would challenge them? Reed immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. Judge Coleman considered it for a moment. Sustained. Rephrase, Mr. Bishop. Mack gave a small nod before refocusing on Whitaker. Let's put it this way. Have you ever seen cases where a development company knowingly built beyond a legally defined boundary, assuming the other party wouldn't fight back? Whitaker hesitated. I have in some cases. Mack nodded. In some cases. He turned toward the jury. Would you say Fairmont Development is one of those companies? Whitaker swallowed, shifting slightly in his seat. I can't say for sure. Mack walked back to his table, picking up the thick file of Fairmont's past legal disputes. He set it down with a weighty thud. I can. He turned back to Whitaker. Are you aware that Fairmont has settled multiple property disputes out of court in the last 15 years? 5, to be exact. Reed shot to his feet again. Objection. Relevance. Judge Coleman sighed. I'll allow it. Proceed. Mack locked eyes with Whitaker. 5 cases all settled before they ever made it to trial. Tell me, Mr. Whitaker, does that sound like a company that accidentally misinterprets property lines? Whitaker looked visibly uncomfortable now. I suppose that's a matter of perspective. Mack nodded slightly. Sure it is. He turned back toward the jury, letting that moment settle before speaking again. No further questions. As Mack returned to his seat, Reed sat down stiffly at the defense table, adjusting his tie, his fingers tapping against the wood as Calloway leaned in. This is turning into a damn mess, Calloway muttered under his breath. Reed exhaled sharply. I know. But across the courtroom, Mack remained composed. He could feel it now, the shift. The jury wasn't just hearing his words. They were listening. And for the first time since the trial had begun, the defense knew it too. The courtroom was no longer a stage for amusement. The low chuckles and dismissive glances that had marked the early days of the trial were long gone, replaced by an air thick with tension, uncertainty. Malcolm Mack Bishop sat still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his posture calm, but his presence undeniable. Across the room, Ethan Calloway's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming anxiously against the polished wood of the defense table. Jonathan Reed, usually the picture of controlled confidence, was shifting in his seat, his mind working frantically to reassert dominance over a case that was slipping through his fingers. Judge Richard Coleman exhaled, rubbing his temple before turning his attention back to the courtroom. Mr. Bishop, he said, his tone more measured than before, do you have another witness to call before we proceed to closing arguments? Mack stood, buttoning the front of his jacket as he spoke. Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Mr. Darius Hayes to the stand. The name sent a ripple of confusion through the defense table. Calloway's brow furrowed as he leaned toward Reed. Who the hell is Darius Hayes? Reed's expression was unreadable, but the way his shoulders stiffened told the truth. He didn't know. That alone was enough to make Calloway uneasy. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a man in his early 50s stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a lawyer or a corporate figure. He wore a simple work jacket, scuffed boots, and jeans that bore the wear of long hours in the sun. His face was lined, not just from age, but from experience, the kind that came from years of hard labor. He moved to the witness stand, raising his right hand as he was sworn in, his expression unreadable. Mack approached slowly, his movements methodical, like a man who already knew the answers to the questions he was about to ask. Mr. Hayes, Mack began, his voice steady, can you tell the court what you do for a living? Darius cleared his throat. I'm a construction foreman. Been in the business for over 20 years. Mack nodded. And who was your most recent employer? Darius hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Calloway. Then Reed. then back to Mac. Finally, he exhaled. Fairmont Development. The room shifted. Even Judge Coleman's expression tightened slightly. Reed stood immediately. Your Honor, I object to this witness. He was not disclosed to the defense, and we were given no prior knowledge of his testimony. Mac didn't flinch. Mr. Hayes came forward last night, Your Honor. He wasn't originally part of my witness list, but after hearing the testimony presented so far, he realized he had information relevant to this case. Judge Coleman studied Darius for a long moment, then turned back to Reed. Mr. Reed, you'll have a chance to cross-examine. For now, the witness stays. Reed sat down, his jaw set. Calloway's fingers tightened into fists against the table. Mac turned back to Darius. Mr. Hayes, you worked on the construction site for the Fairmont development in Augusta, correct? Darius nodded. That's right. And during that time, did you see anything that concerned you? Darius hesitated. A beat of silence passed, the weight of his next words hanging over the room like an impending storm. Then, finally, he exhaled. Yeah, I did. Mac didn't press. He let the moment settle. Let Darius gather his own courage before speaking again. Tell us what you saw. Darius glanced at Calloway once more before turning back to the jury, his voice rough but firm. There were two sets of plans. A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire. Reed shot to his feet. Objection. Speculative, and without any supporting evidence. Mac held up a hand. I was getting to that. He turned back to Darius. Mr. Hayes, do you have proof of these two sets of plans? Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. I made a backup of all project files before construction began. These documents show two different versions of the same development, one that was submitted legally, and one that included modifications to push the property lines past where they should have been. The room exploded in murmurs. Judge Coleman tapped his gavel. Order. He turned to the bailiff. Take that drive and have it submitted into evidence immediately. Calloway's face had gone pale. Reed clenched his fists beneath the table, his carefully constructed case now resting on the edge of a knife. Mac turned back to Darius. Did Fairmont Development know they were building past the legal boundary? Darius swallowed hard. Yes, sir. We all knew. We were told to keep quiet about it. The weight of those words settled over the room like a stone. Mac nodded once, stepping back. No further questions. Reed stood, his movements quick and sharp, but the composure he had worn so well was fraying. He approached the witness stand, forcing a polite smile. Mr. Hayes, you're claiming that you kept evidence of these so-called illegal modifications this entire time, but only decided to bring them forward now. Why is that? Darius's jaw tightened. Because I watched this trial. I saw Mr. Bishop standing up there, alone, just trying to get justice, and I realized that's the kind of man I should be. The silence that followed was deafening. Reed cleared his throat, struggling to regain control. Mr. Hayes, are you aware that tampering with company documents is a serious offense? Darius didn't blink. You mean like tampering with property lines? A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the gallery. Reed's face darkened. He inhaled sharply, then exhaled through his nose. No further questions. Judge Coleman adjusted his glasses. This court will take a brief recess before moving forward. He banged the gavel, and the courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters scrambled toward the doors, eager to broadcast what had just unfolded. At the defense table, Calloway turned toward Reed, his voice low and seething. Fix this. Reed exhaled. I don't think I can. Across the room, Mac remained seated, calm as ever. He had spent a lifetime fighting battles he wasn't supposed to win, and he knew a victory when he saw one. The courtroom had transformed. It was no longer the stage for corporate dominance, no longer a place where power dictated the narrative. No, this was something else now. The tides had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The air was thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Darius Hayes's testimony, the damning revelation of the two sets of construction plans, and the undeniable proof that Fairmont Development had built past the legal boundary intentionally. There was no ambiguity anymore, no misunderstandings, no administrative discrepancies. Just cold, calculated deception, now laid bare for everyone to see. Malcolm Mac Bishop sat still, his face unreadable, his presence immovable. Across the courtroom, Ethan Calloway leaned forward, gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His carefully curated mask of calm was slipping, cracking at the edges. He wasn't the unshakable CEO anymore, the man who could bury problems with money and influence. He was something else now, exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time since this trial began, afraid. Jonathan Reed, the ever-composed attorney, wasn't much better. He sat stiffly in his chair, flipping through the legal pad in front of him, though it was clear his mind wasn't processing the words anymore. He knew what was coming. He could feel it, creeping closer with every second that passed. Judge Richard Coleman returned to the bench, his robe shifting as he settled into his seat. He adjusted his glasses, then exhaled. This court is now back in session. His voice was heavier than before, not just because of what had been revealed, but because of what it meant. Reed stood, buttoning his jacket with a forced sense of composure. He was a man grasping at the last vestiges of control, trying to steer a sinking ship toward anything resembling safety. He turned to the jury, his smile polite but thin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone measured, "we've had quite a morning. Emotions have run high, and we've heard some, let's call them, dramatic revelations. But I want to bring us back to the foundation of this case, because at the end of the day, this is still a property dispute. And property disputes are resolved through legal precedent, through due process, through the interpretation of facts." Max stood. "Your Honor." Reed stopped mid-sentence, irritated at the interruption. Judge Coleman turned toward Mac with a raised brow. "Mr. Bishop." Mac's voice was steady, unwavering. "If Mr. Reed is done performing, I'd like to proceed." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room, though the judge quickly silenced them with a glance. Reed exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of his nose before muttering, "No further remarks, Your Honor." He sat down, jaw clenched. Judge Coleman turned back to Mac. "Mr. Bishop, you may proceed with your closing argument." Mac took a step forward, placing both hands on the table in front of him. He didn't pace. He didn't gesture wildly. He didn't try to overwhelm the room with theatrics. He just stood there, rooted in place, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled. "I've lived on that land for more than 3 decades, he began. I'd built my home on it. I worked the soil. I paid my taxes. I followed every law, every regulation, every requirement this county ever put in place." He let his gaze move across the jury. But none of that mattered to Fairmont Development. He turned slightly, just enough to face Calloway, but he didn't need to look directly at him for the message to land. They didn't see a home. They didn't see something worth respecting. They saw an opportunity. He turned back to the jury. They saw a chance to take what wasn't theirs, to push just far enough past the line that they thought no one would notice. Or maybe they thought no one would fight back. The room was silent. They ignored my warnings, ignored the legal notices, ignored the cease and desist orders. And when that wasn't enough, they altered their own records to cover up what they were doing. He gestured toward the evidence table. "You saw the proof. The second set of construction plans, the emails, the witness testimony. Everything they did was intentional." Mac exhaled slowly, then continued. "I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a team of legal experts. I don't have $1 million defense fund. But what I do have is the truth. And the truth is that this land is mine. It was mine when I bought it, mine when I built on it, and mine when Fairmont decided they could take it from me." A beat of silence. "Today you decide if they were right." Mac stepped back from the table. "That's all I have to say." Judge Coleman turned to Reed. "Mr. Reed, the defense may proceed with its closing argument." Reed stood slowly, forcing a small smile as he walked to the jury. But the confidence that had once radiated from him was gone. He knew, just as well as everyone else, that this case had already been decided. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, voice smooth, but lacking its usual sharpness, "property law is complex. What may seem clear-cut is often anything but. My client acted based on the information available to him, and while mistakes may have been made, those mistakes were not made in bad faith. I ask that you consider the possibility that this was not an act of malice, but rather an unfortunate misunderstanding." He hesitated for half a second before adding, "Thank you." It was weak. Even he knew it. Judge Coleman turned back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you now have the case. Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached. The gavel hit the wood, and the murmurs began immediately. As the jury filed out, reporters rushed toward the exits, their voices eager, their phones raised. The world outside was waiting for a decision, but inside the courtroom, Mack remained still. Calloway stood, jaw tight, hands shaking slightly as he turned toward Reed. "We should have settled," he muttered under his breath. Reed didn't answer. He didn't need to, because it was too late for that now. The jury had been deliberating for hours. Inside the Richmond County Courthouse, the tension had reached a suffocating peak. Spectators who had once chuckled at the idea of Malcolm Mack Bishop representing himself now sat in stiff silence, their eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors that led to the jury room. Some leaned forward, gripping the edges of their seats. Others whispered amongst themselves, trading theories, dissecting the case like it was the most important thing they had ever witnessed. And in many ways it was. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about justice, about whether a man like Mack, a man without corporate lawyers, without political connections, without wealth, could stand against a company that had spent decades bending the law to its will. Mack sat at his table, his expression unreadable, hands folded loosely in front of him. He had waited longer for things in life. He had waited for fair wages, for equal treatment, for doors that had taken too long to open. He could wait for this. Across the room, Jonathan Reed sat stiffly at the defense table, his fingers clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white. His suit, which had started the day crisp and immaculate, now seemed to sag slightly under the weight of what was coming. Next to him, Ethan Calloway wasn't even trying to hide his irritation anymore. His jaw was tight, his fingers tapping against the polished wood. Every so often, he'd lean in and whisper something to Reed, his voice low, sharp. Reed didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Then, the door to the jury room opened. The bailiff stepped inside, his face unreadable as he turned to Judge Richard Coleman. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." The room held its breath. "Bring them in," Coleman said. The jurors filed back into the courtroom one by one, their expressions heavy, their movements deliberate. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair, clutched a sealed envelope in her hands as she approached the bench. She handed it to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. Coleman took a moment to glance at the paper inside, his expression giving nothing away. Then he turned toward the jury. "Madam Forewoman, has the jury reached a unanimous decision?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict." She cleared her throat, her voice steady but weighted. "In the matter of Bishop v. Fairmont Development, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Malcolm Bishop. We find that the defendant, Fairmont Development, knowingly and unlawfully encroached upon the plaintiff's property and acted in bad faith by ignoring multiple legal notices. Furthermore, we find the defendant guilty of willful misconduct and award the plaintiff full compensation for damages, as well as additional punitive damages." The words crashed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the murmurs began. Reporters whispered urgently into their phones, fingers flying across keyboards as they typed out headlines that would spread across the country within minutes. Corporate giant Fairmont Development loses landmark case. Self-represented plaintiff triumphs over billion-dollar company. Justice served in Augusta. Jury rules in favor of Malcolm Bishop. At the defense table, Calloway was frozen. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered between the judge, the jury, and Mack, as if trying to process how this had happened, how he had lost. Reed, for all his legal expertise, was no better. His carefully curated persona had cracked, his lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. Mack didn't move at first, didn't react. Then, slowly he exhaled, the weight of a battle that had stretched far beyond this courtroom settling into his bones. Judge Coleman nodded once, his voice firm. "This court acknowledges the jury's decision. The defendant is hereby ordered to immediately cease all construction on the plaintiff's property, remove any existing structures built unlawfully, and pay all damages as ruled by this court. Any attempts to appeal must follow the proper legal process, but as of today, this ruling is final." His gaze flickered toward Calloway just briefly. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck wood. And just like that, it was over. The room erupted into motion. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone who looked willing to speak. Some tried to get to Mac, shouting questions, asking for a statement. Others turned to Calloway, though the CEO was already pushing his way toward the exit, Reed hurrying behind him, whispering something urgent. Mac stood slowly. He turned, and for the first time since the trial began, he met Calloway's eyes directly. There was no gloating in his gaze, no smugness, no satisfaction at watching a man like Calloway lose. There was only finality, a quiet, unwavering certainty that what had just happened was not revenge, not victory, but justice. Calloway, for all his power, had nothing left to say. As Mac stepped away from the plaintiff's table, a few people clapped, hesitant at first, then stronger. It wasn't wild applause, wasn't the kind of thing you saw in movies where the underdog wins against all odds. It was something realer, a simple acknowledgement of the kind of fight that mattered. At the back of the room, Darius Hayes stood, nodding once when Mac's gaze met his. A silent exchange. "You did the right thing." Darius nodded again, then slipped out of the courtroom, disappearing into the growing crowd outside. Mac didn't linger. He didn't stay to give interviews, didn't wait to soak in the moment. He had never been a man who needed the spotlight. He gathered his papers, adjusted his jacket, and walked out the courtroom doors. The sun was warm against his skin. Outside, more reporters waited. Cameras were pointed in his direction. Questions were shouted at him. "Mr. Bishop, how does it feel to win against $1 billion company? What are you going to do next? Do you think this sets a precedent for other landowners?" Mac paused, looking out at the sea of microphones and flashing lights. Then, in a voice steady and firm, he said, "Justice was served today. Not because I had the most money, not because I had the best lawyers, but because the truth was on my side. And when the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty. You just need to stand your ground." And with that, he tipped his hat slightly, turned away from the cameras, and walked toward his truck. Because the fight was over. And he was going home. The news spread fast. By the time Malcolm Mac Bishop's truck pulled onto the long dirt road leading home, the world already knew. His name was on the lips of news anchors, splashed across headlines, trending on social media. Self-represented plaintiff defeats corporate giant in landmark case. Bishop sees. Fairmont, a battle for justice. David and Goliath in the courtroom, and David wins. But none of that mattered to him. He pulled up to the familiar stretch of land he had fought for, the land that had been his for over 30 years. The sun was beginning to set, casting an amber glow over the trees, the grass swaying in the breeze. He climbed out of the truck, inhaling deeply. The scent of earth, the quiet hum of cicadas in the distance. Home. He stepped onto the porch, placing his hand against the wooden frame of the house he had built with his own hands. It had been more than just a house, more than just property. It had been his foundation, his roots. And now, no one could take that away from him. Behind him, another truck rolled up the path. Mac turned as Judge Richard Coleman stepped out, hands in his pockets. The older man looked at Mac for a moment before nodding toward the land. "Didn't think I'd see the day a man took on a company like Fairmont and actually won." Mac smirked. "Didn't think I'd see the day a judge admitted he was wrong about me." Coleman chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough." He took a few steps closer, glancing at the open fields. "You gonna do anything with it? Expand? Build something new?" Mac shook his head. "No, just gonna keep it the way it is." Coleman nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He looked back at Mac, his face thoughtful. "I misjudged you when you first walked into that courtroom. Thought you were another stubborn old man who didn't know what he was doing." He paused. "I was wrong." Mac studied him for a moment before finally extending his hand. "Appreciate that." Coleman shook it, firm and brief. "Take care of yourself, Bishop." Mac watched as the judge climbed back into his truck and pulled away, disappearing down the long stretch of road. He stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle. Then, from the distance, he heard another vehicle approaching. He turned as a familiar figure stepped out, a man in a worn work jacket, his hands shoved into his pockets. Darius Hayes. Mac met his gaze, and the two men stood there, unspeaking, before Darius finally exhaled. "Figured I'd stop by. See if you needed a hand with anything." Mac raised an eyebrow. "You got a job?" Darius hesitated, then shook his head. Not anymore. Max smirked. They fire you. Darius let out a dry laugh. They told me to clean out my locker before I even left the stand. He sighed. I knew what I was risking when I testified, but I did it anyway. Mac nodded slowly. Yeah, you did. Darius looked at the land, taking in the open fields, the stretch of green untouched by corporate greed. So, you need a hand or what? Mac let the question linger before finally nodding toward the side of the house. Tools are in the shed. If you're gonna work, might as well start with fixing that damn fence. Darius cracked a small grin. Yes, sir. As he walked off toward the shed, Mac turned back toward his land. The fight was over. The dust had settled. And yet the world kept moving. Fairmont Development was already feeling the weight of its loss. Reports were coming in that other landowners were stepping forward, filing lawsuits of their own. Stockholders were pulling out, investors scrambling. The company that once operated above the law was now under investigation, the cracks in its foundation spreading fast. Ethan Calloway had vanished from the public eye. Last Mac heard, Fairmont was preparing an appeal, but it wouldn't change anything. The truth was out. The world had seen what they had done, and even if they tried to fight it, they had already lost. Mac didn't care about any of that. He cared about the land beneath his feet, the home behind him, the quiet certainty that no one would ever take it from him again. He ran a hand over the wooden railing of his porch, then stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The battle was over. And he had won. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.